It all began the cold night we moved into the old house, an isolated, creaking relic at the edge of town. I remember the air was unusually sharp, each breath a visible puff hanging in the silence. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray gloom that seemed to press in, swallowing even the faint glow of the street lamps. It wasn't the sort of night you'd want to be alone in, but we were all too eager, caught between excitement and exhaustion after the long drive. I was the first to notice the basement door, tucked away behind a loose panel in the hallway. It wasn't on the floor plan we'd studied, hidden as if it had been deliberately concealed for years. Something about it felt off. The way the paint was newer, the wood less worn than the rest of the house. Still, curiosity got the better of us. We found an old, rusty key on the kitchen counter, just lying there as if waiting. The basement smelled like damp earth and forgotten memories. The air was thick, musty, and cold enough to make my skin prickle. We used our phones as flashlights, the narrow beam trembling across cracked stone walls and piles of discarded furniture covered in decades of dust. Then, tucked in the far corner under a collapsed wooden shelf, we saw it. A leather-bound diary, worn and brittle, its cover cracked and stained. The handwriting on the front was nearly illegible but unmistakably aged. I hesitated before picking it up. There was an odd weight to it, not just physical but something heavier, like the weight of secrets better left alone. None of us said it, but I could feel a shared unease settle quietly between us, a silent warning carried on the stale basement air. Still, we opened it. The first page was filled with strange symbols and hurried scrawls, a date inked in the early 1900s. The diary smelled of old paper and something else, something metallic and cold, like blood dried into tatas. Fibers. The entries began with mundane notes about the house and its strange inhabitants, but beneath the surface, something darker lurked. I couldn't shake the feeling that this diary wasn't just a record, it was a warning. As I flipped through the fragile pages, the night seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around us deepened. We started reading the diary aloud, mostly as a joke at first, trying to break the tension that had quietly settled over us. The words were faded, but the stories inside were vivid, sometimes disturbingly so. The writer described strange noises echoing through the house at night, flickering lights, and fleeting shadows no one could explain. It was almost like the diary was alive, whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. As the night deepened, the basement's cold seemed to seep into my bones. My breath came out in shallow clouds, and the beam from my phone flickered, as if the battery was dying suddenly. But it wasn't. Everyone else's lights were fine. Then, without warning, a faint creaking sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the basement, distant but unmistakable. We all froze. No one moved or spoke. The air grew heavier, the silence stretching in a way that felt wrong. The diary's pages trembled slightly in my hands, and for a moment I thought I saw the shadows around us shift, as if they were watching. My skin prickled. My heart hammered so loud I thought it might give me away. One of my friends laughed nervously, breaking the spell, but even then, I could feel it. The creeping, crawling dread that something unseen was close by. We tried to convince ourselves it was just old pipes or the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. It grew closer. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that screamed louder than anything. When I looked up, I caught a glimpse of something, maybe a figure, at the edge of the light, gone the instant. I blinked. No one else claimed to see it, but after that moment, the diary's words didn't feel like stories anymore. They felt like predictions, and suddenly, every creak, every shadow felt like a warning we were too late to heed. After that moment, none of us spoke for a long time. The basement, once just a dusty storage room, felt like a living thing, watching, waiting. My hand still trembled from holding the diary, and the faint metallic smell seemed to linger in the air, mixing with the cold dampness. I wanted to convince myself that it was just nerves, that the shadows were tricks of the light and our imagination running wild, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Back upstairs, the house felt different too, less like a home and more like a cage. I found myself glancing at the basement door as if expecting it to creak open on its own. The others tried to laugh it off, but I could see the same hollow look in their eyes. We all felt it. That quiet terror that settles when something unknown has touched your life. I kept turning over the diary's pages in my mind, trying to make sense of the cryptic entries. The handwriting shifted from neat to frantic, as if the writer's fear grew with every word. Some passages hinted at fate and death, but it felt like vague threats at first, until that shadow. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak upstairs sounded like footsteps. Every flicker of a light seemed deliberate, and beneath it all, the diary's words echoed, relentless and dark. That night I realized this was no ordinary diary. It was a warning, a trap, or maybe even a curse. We had stumbled into something we couldn't understand, and whatever was waiting for us in that house was already closing in. The morning after our basement discovery, the cold didn't seem to lift. The house was eerily silent except for the occasional creak and groan of its aging frame. Outside, a thin mist curled around the bare branches, swallowing the weak sunlight. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something we didn't yet understand. We gathered around the kitchen table, the diary placed carefully in the center, its cracked leather cover looking almost sinister in the pale morning light. The others were still shaken, but trying to shake off the dread like a bad dream. I couldn't blame them. I was trying too, even as my thoughts raced. I remembered the first full entry we read that night. It was dated back over a century, written in a delicate hand that slowly grew more desperate with each page. The writer described strange occurrences, footsteps when no one was there, whispers in the dead of night, and fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures just out of sight. At first it seemed like the ramblings of a lonely soul trapped in that house, but the details felt personal, almost too real. We decided to read more together, hoping to find answers or some explanation for what we'd felt. As I traced the faded ink with my finger, I felt the strange pull of the diary again, like it was more than just paper and words. The house around us felt heavy, as if time had slowed, and the air tasted faintly metallic, like before. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the normal sounds, the distant hum of a passing car, the rustle of leaves outside the cracked window. But beneath it all, the house seemed to whisper its own secrets, waiting for us to listen. As we read more from the diary, the words started to twist and knot inside my mind like a slowly tightening noose. The writer spoke of events that were vague at first, like fleeting shadows on the edge of vision, disembodied whispers, cold spots that moved through the rooms, and doors that creaked open by themselves. But then the entries began mentioning specific people, names that unnervingly matched some of ours. One passage chilled me more than the rest. It described a group of friends who had gathered in the house, just like us, and how one of them would not live to see the next dawn. The handwriting here was frantic, scrawled with jagged, uneven strokes. I tried to laugh it off, but the weight of those words settled deep inside my chest, heavy and cold. Suddenly, a sharp thud echoed from upstairs. Our voices dropped, the room falling into tense silence. We looked around, half expecting something, or someone to appear. The diary felt heavier in my hands, like it was pulling me into a darkness I wasn't ready to face. I glanced toward the window where the mist had thickened into a low-hanging fog that obscured the world outside. The house seemed to breathe with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each creak like a whispered warning. As I read the words again, a sudden cold breeze swept through the room. Despite the windows being shut tight, the pages fluttered violently, as if alive. I caught a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow darker than the dim light could explain, but when I turned, nothing was there. The others looked pale, their faces tight with fear they tried hard to mask. We closed the diary reluctantly, but the dread lingered. The predictions weren't just stories anymore. They felt like a countdown. After we closed the diary, the room felt impossibly still, like the air itself had thickened with something unseen. The others tried to joke and to shake off the tension, but their voices came out strained, brittle. I kept staring at the worn pages, feeling an unsettling mix of disbelief and growing dread. How could a diary written over 100 years ago know our names? How could it predict things that felt so real? I remember the ache in my chest, a heavy, slow-burning fear that seeped into every part of me. It wasn't just about the diary or the strange noises anymore. It was about what it meant. Something was wrong with this place. Something was watching us, waiting for something. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flickers of shadow and felt the cold breath of the house on my neck. My mind raced through every word, every sentence, trying to find a mistake, a trick, anything to tell me this was all just a nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The diary was a key, a terrifying, ancient key, and we had already turned it. I couldn't stop thinking about the friend mentioned in the diary, the one who would not live to see the next dawn. Was it just a warning or a promise? And if it was real, who would it be? That night, as the house groaned and whispered, I realized this was only the beginning. Night came swiftly that evening, wrapping the house in a thick blanket of cold and shadow. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the weak glow of the porch light until it felt like we were completely cut off from the world. Inside, the house creaked and sighed under the weight of the night, every small sound amplified in the eerie silence. I tried to settle into the routine of the evening, but my nerves were frayed. Every glance toward the basement door, every shifting shadow on the wall made my skin crawl. The others were quieter now, their usual chatter replaced by uneasy glances and whispered conversations. We all knew something was watching, something unseen. The diary sat on the coffee table, its worn leather cover cracked and darkened by time. I could feel its weight on the room, like a silent presence demanding attention. The flicker of the old fireplace cast strange shapes across the walls, and I found myself straining to catch any movement beyond the dancing flames. Outside, the wind had fallen completely still. The usual night sounds, crickets, distant cars, were gone, replaced by an oppressive hush. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was cold, but not from the weather. It felt heavier, thicker, like the space between breaths had grown too long. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to ignore the creeping sensation that we were not alone. As the night deepened, that oppressive silence gave way to something worse, soft sounds, barely perceptible at first. A whisper, maybe, or the faintest scrape, like nails against wood. I froze, straining my ears, but the others seemed oblivious, caught up in their own nervous energy. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing somewhere just beyond the walls. The basement door creaked open just a crack, as if pushed by an invisible hand, and a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the flames in the fireplace. Darkness swallowed us. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the gloom, casting long shadows that danced and twisted like living things. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, mingling with the sounds of something moving just beyond sight. When I dared to look, I saw it, at the edge of the light, a shape, blurred and shifting, watching us. No one else saw it, but I knew it was there. The diary's words echoed in my mind, eyes that never blink. I wanted to tell the others, but the words caught in my throat, swallowed by the cold dread pooling in my stomach. The house groaned again, low and mournful, as if mourning something long lost. The shadows pressed closer, filling every corner with silence and fear. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet felt rooted, my voice trapped behind an invisible barrier. That night, the house wasn't just a building. It was a presence, a watcher, a predator, and we were its prey. After that night, sleep became a distant memory. Every creak, every whisper in the dark, haunted my thoughts long after dawn broke. I kept replaying what I saw, or thought I saw, in the flickering shadows. Was it real, or was my mind unraveling under the weight of fear? The diary's chilling phrase, "eyes that never blink," echoed in my mind like a warning I couldn't escape. The others tried to convince me it was just nerves, that old houses play tricks on you, but their pale faces and jittery glances told a different story. We all felt it, something watching, waiting patiently. The house's silence was no longer comforting. It was a suffocating presence that followed us wherever we went. I found myself avoiding the basement door, yet unable to stay away from the diary. It called to me, pulling me deeper into its mystery, dragging me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to face. There was a weight pressing down on my chest, a tightness that didn't fade, no matter how much I tried to breathe through it. Fear had become a constant companion, whispering doubts and dark possibilities. What if the diary wasn't just a record? What if it was a map, leading us towards something we couldn't escape? That night, I realized the house had become a prison, and the key to our fate was already in our hands. The days blurred into one another as the house's heavy silence pressed in on us. The basement door remained shut, but the unease it stirred was impossible to ignore. I found myself drawn back to that cold, shadowed space despite every warning ringing in my mind. The air near the door always felt colder, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep through the walls and settle in my bones. Every time I passed the hallway, I caught myself glancing toward that door, feeling as if something just beyond it was watching. There was no sound, no movement, just a quiet, relentless presence, patient and waiting. The others avoided mentioning the basement altogether, their silence adding to the growing weight in the room. The diary had become an obsession. I pored over the pages, searching for clues, for anything that might explain the strange, suffocating feeling that had settled over us. The handwriting was more erratic now, scrawled in desperate bursts. A recurring phrase kept appearing. Eyes that never blink. It was cryptic, but the dread it carried was unmistakable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and pushing shadows to dance across the walls. The house groaned under the pressure of the storm brewing beyond, but inside, the storm was quiet, a stillness charged with unseen eyes watching every move. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to twist and flicker, and the silence was broken only by the faintest whispering that I couldn't quite place. I stayed near the basement door, my breath shallow, every nerve screaming that something lurked just beyond. Suddenly, a faint scraping sound came from the other side of the door, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear against the cold wood, straining to catch any other noise. The scraping stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt thicker than the night itself. Then I noticed it. Tiny scratches, almost like pinpricks, tracing the outline of an eye on the door. They weren't there before. My skin prickled as I realized the marks were fresh, as if something had been watching me silently, with unblinking eyes. I stepped back, the diary's words echoing in my mind. Eyes that never blink. A chill ran down my spine as the basement door slowly creaked open, just a crack, as if inviting me into the darkness. I wanted to run, to close the door and lock it tight, but my feet wouldn't move. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening until they swallowed the doorway whole. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back from the darkness, unblinking, patient, and full of something ancient and hungry. After that night, the basement door became a barrier I both feared and obsessed over. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing, unblinking eyes staring at me from the darkness. The house, once just old and quiet, had transformed into a place alive with unseen watchers. The scratches on the door gnawed at me, like a silent accusation, proof that whatever was there wasn't just a trick of my imagination. I tried to rationalize it, maybe an animal or a neighbor's prank, but none of it fit. The cold dread settled deep inside, heavier than before, and the diary's cryptic warnings echoed louder with every passing hour. I noticed myself flinching at every creak, every shifting shadow. Sleep became a distant memory. The house's silence was no longer comforting. It was a looming presence that filled every corner of my mind. The others kept their distance from the basement now, but I knew the danger wasn't just behind the door. It was inside all of us, waiting to be released. I wondered if the diary was more than a record. Maybe it was a warning, a curse, or even a countdown. The thought haunted me. How long before the eyes closed on us for good? Her fear was contagious. Paranoia spiraled out of control. We began suspecting one another, each believing someone among us might be responsible for the strange occurrences or even for Michael's death. Arguments flared, friendships fractured, and the house seemed to laugh in response, its cold walls echoing with our despair. I felt my own mind fraying at the edges, caught between terror and the desperate need for answers. The diary's predictions loomed over us like a dark cloud, each new entry tightening the noose of fate. That night, it became clear that the house wasn't just claiming lives. It was breaking minds, turning friends into enemies, and twisting reality into something unrecognizable. The chaos that night left scars deeper than any visible wound. I watched as fear ate away at the bonds we once shared, leaving behind fragments of suspicion and shattered trust. Sarah's screams still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of how fragile our sanity had become. Sleep was impossible. Every creak in the house felt like a threat, every shadow a potential enemy. I found myself lying awake, heart pounding, torn between the desperate need to stay alert and the crushing exhaustion that dragged me toward a restless, haunted sleep. The diary lay nearby, its pages seeming to pulse with an ominous energy, as if feeding on our collective dread. I could feel paranoia twisting inside me like a living thing. The faces of my friends flashed in my mind, each expression tinged with fear or anger. We were prisoners not only of the house but of ourselves. The once solid foundation of friendship was crumbling, eroded by doubt and terror. And yet, beneath the chaos, a small, stubborn part of me clung to hope. I wanted to believe we could survive this, that we could somehow outsmart whatever force was hunting us. But every day, the diary's predictions tightened their grip, each one more terrifying than the last. The house was no longer just a place. It was a trap. And the walls were closing in. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on before the darkness swallowed us all. The house had become a prison, but we still clung to the fragile hope that locking ourselves away might keep the darkness at bay. After the spiraling chaos and the first death, we barricaded the doors and windows, desperate to create a barrier between us and whatever waited outside or within. The basement door was locked tighter than ever, the scratches still raw on its surface like a warning we couldn't ignore. The air inside the house was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something metallic that never quite left. Outside, the wind howled like a mournful ghost, rattling the old panes as if trying to claw its way in. We gathered in the largest room, the walls closing in with every passing hour. The diary sat between us, its pages worn but still filled with secrets that refused to stay buried. We read cautiously now, each entry revealing more about the house's dark past, a tale of tragedy, obsession, and a curse older than any of us could have imagined. The author's story unfolded in jagged, desperate handwriting, someone trapped in a nightmare that mirrored our own. Flashbacks to the past whispered through the diary's words, hinting at the origin of the curse and the house's hunger for souls. Every page was a thread pulling us deeper into the unknown. The weight of history pressed down, and the air around us seemed to grow colder, thicker. The house was alive with memories and pain, and it wasn't done with us yet. The night we barricaded ourselves inside, the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The walls whispered with secrets too terrible to speak aloud, and every shadow felt alive, watching, waiting. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the house was holding its breath before unleashing whatever horror lurked within. Her fear was contagious. Paranoia spiraled out of control. We began suspecting one another, each believing someone among us might be responsible for the strange occurrences or even for Michael's death. Arguments flared, friendships fractured, and the house seemed to laugh in response, its cold walls echoing with our despair. I felt my own mind fraying at the edges, caught between terror and the desperate need for answers. The diary's predictions loomed over us like a dark cloud, each new entry tightening the noose of fate. That night, it became clear that the house wasn't just claiming lives, it was breaking minds, turning friends into enemies, and twisting reality into something unrecognizable. The chaos that night left scars deeper than any visible wound. I watched as fear ate away at the bonds we once shared, leaving behind fragments of suspicion and shattered trust. Sarah's screams still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of how fragile our sanity had become. Sleep was impossible. Every creak in the house felt like a threat, every shadow a potential enemy. I found myself lying awake, heart pounding, torn between the desperate need to stay alert and the crushing exhaustion that dragged me toward a restless, haunted sleep. The diary lay nearby, its pages seeming to pulse with an ominous energy, as if feeding on our collective dread. I could feel paranoia twisting inside me like a living thing. The faces of my friends flashed in my mind, each expression tinged with fear or anger. We were prisoners not only of the house but of ourselves. The once solid foundation of friendship was crumbling, eroded by doubt and terror. And yet, beneath the chaos, a small, stubborn part of me clung to hope. I wanted to believe we could survive this, that we could somehow outsmart whatever force was hunting us. But every day, the diary's predictions tightened their grip, each one more terrifying than the last. The house was no longer just a place. It was a trap, and the walls were closing in. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on before the darkness swallowed us all. The house had become a prison, but we still clung to the fragile hope that locking ourselves away might keep the darkness at bay. After the spiraling chaos and the first death, we barricaded the doors and windows, desperate to create a barrier between us and whatever waited outside or within. The basement door was locked tighter than ever, the scratches still raw on its surface like a warning we couldn't ignore. The air inside the house was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something metallic that never quite left. Outside, the wind howled like a mournful ghost, rattling the old panes as if trying to claw its way in. We gathered in the largest room, the walls closing in with every passing hour. The diary sat between us, its pages worn but still filled with secrets that refused to stay buried. We read cautiously now, each entry revealing more about the house's dark past, a tale of tragedy, obsession, and a curse older than any of us could have imagined. The author's story unfolded in jagged, desperate handwriting, someone trapped in a nightmare that mirrored our own. Flashbacks to the past whispered through the diary's words, hinting at the origin of the curse and the house's hunger for souls. Every page was a thread pulling us deeper into the unknown. The weight of history pressed down, and the air around us seemed to grow colder, thicker. The house was alive with memories and pain, and it wasn't done with us yet. The night we barricaded ourselves inside, the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The walls whispered with secrets too terrible to speak aloud, and every shadow felt alive, watching, waiting. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the house was holding its breath before unleashing whatever horror lurked within. As we huddled together, the diary opened on the floor, its pages trembling despite the still air. The author's voice came through the faded words, telling a story of obsession and madness, a previous occupant trapped by the same curse, desperate to warn whoever might come after. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed from the basement door, followed by a slow, deliberate scratching, like claws raking against wood. We froze, hearts pounding in unison. The door, locked tight just moments before, began to creak open inch by inch, revealing nothing but thick, impenetrable darkness. The cold air that poured out was unlike any chill we'd felt before, biting and unnatural. A whisper floated up from the depths, unintelligible but filled with menace. One by one, our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic surged through the room, voices rising in terrified chaos. In the blackness, I thought I saw movement, something slinking just beyond the edge of my vision. Eyes, unblinking and glowing faintly, stared back at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. That night, the house showed us its true face, a hunger that could not be denied, a curse that bound us all. And we were all trapped within its grasp. The darkness that swallowed us that night was heavier than any fear I had ever known. When the flashlights died and the whispers began, I felt the world close in around me like a suffocating shroud. My heart thundered so loudly I was sure it would give me away to whatever waited in the blackness. The glow of those unblinking eyes burned in my mind's eye long after we scrambled to relight our torches and slammed the basement door shut again. The air remained cold, colder than before, as if the house itself was wounded, angry that we had tried to lock away its secret. Frantic moments after, the group was fractured by panic and exhaustion. Words came in broken gasps, apologies mixed with accusations. Trust, already fragile, seemed irreparably cracked. I caught myself staring at every shadow, questioning if it hid something waiting to strike. The diary lay open, pages fluttering as if breathing. I touched its worn surface, feeling a twisted connection between those ancient words and the living nightmare that had become our reality. The curse was no longer just a story. It was here, it was hungry, and it was patient. Sleep fled me that night, replaced by a cold awareness that time was slipping away. The house's hunger was real, and the longer we stayed, the closer it came. I couldn't stop thinking about the eyes, those endless, unblinking eyes, watching from the dark. We were prisoners now, bound not only by walls and doors, but by something far older and darker, and I knew the question wasn't if the house would claim more lives, but when. The days felt longer now, stretched thin by the thick tension hanging over the house. Each morning dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with low clouds that seemed to press down on us like a suffocating weight. Outside, the wind whispered mournfully through the bare branches, carrying with it the scent of rain and decay. Inside, the house was quieter than ever. The usual creaks and groans were muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. We moved cautiously from room to room, every footstep measured and hesitant. The basement door remained locked tight, a silent barrier to the darkness beneath. I spent hours poring over the diary, searching for anything that might help us understand the curse that bound us. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, but each word seemed alive, pulsing with an energy that chilled me to the bone. The author's story unfolded like a fractured mirror, revealing a past filled with sorrow, madness, and a desperate fight for survival. The diary spoke of a family torn apart by secrets, their lives slowly unraveling under the weight of an ancient evil. It hinted at rituals, warnings carved into hidden places, and a darkness that fed on fear and despair. The deeper I read, the more I felt the past reaching out, intertwining with our own nightmare. Despite the growing dread, I clung to the hope that understanding the history might give us a chance to break free. But as the shadows lengthened and the cold crept in, I knew the house wasn't just a place of memories. It was a living nightmare, and we were trapped inside its darkest chapter. That evening, as the sky darkened to a bruised purple, an unsettling stillness fell over the house. The usual sounds of settling wood and distant wind were absent, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. I sat alone by the window, the diary open on my lap, tracing the faded ink with trembling fingers. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the basement door, soft but deliberate, like a warning or a call. My heart slammed against my ribs. I hesitated, every instinct screaming to ignore it, but the curiosity rooted me in place. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a faint whisper, indecipherable, yet full of menace. I called out, voice barely above a whisper, but no answer came. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching longer, creeping along the walls like tendrils. The diary's pages rustled as if caught in a breeze, though every window was shut tight. Then I saw it. A dark shape, fleeting and indistinct, flickering just beyond the light's reach. I blinked, and it vanished. My breath hitched. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, their words unintelligible but heavy with sorrow and warning. Panic surged through my veins as the basement door creaked open wider, revealing only darkness. From the depths came a cold breath that brushed my cheek, sharp and unnatural. The house seemed to exhale its despair, filling the room with a crushing weight. I stumbled back, heart racing, the diary slipping from my hands. The darkness was alive, pulsing with something ancient and hungry, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that the past was no longer just echoes. It was here, and it was coming for us. The chill that settled after that night refused to leave. The whispers from the basement door echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that the house's past wasn't just history, it was a living, breathing threat. I kept replaying the flicker of shadow I'd seen, the cold breath brushing my skin, as if the house itself had reached out to claim me. Sleep became impossible. Every creak, every sigh of the old house turned into a sinister promise of what might come next. I found myself avoiding the basement hallway, yet unable to stop the pull to the diary, desperate for answers even if they brought more fear. The others were broken too, some withdrawn, others volatile with frustration and terror. Trust between us was frayed, conversations clipped and fearful. The house had already taken one life, shattered our minds, and now it seemed to be closing in, tightening its grip with every passing hour. I realized the diary was more than just a warning. It was a map of our descent, a record of those who came before and failed. The past was bleeding into our present, and the house's hunger was growing. I didn't know how much longer we could hold on, or if there was any escape. But one thing was certain, the shadows that had once been whispers were now roars, and we were trapped inside the darkest chapter yet. The house was unraveling us, piece by piece. Days bled into nights, and the line between reality and nightmare grew thinner with every passing hour. The cold that clung to the walls had seeped into our bones, numbing more than just our bodies. It was in the way we moved, slow, hesitant, as if the air itself was thick with invisible chains. We had become shadows of ourselves, haunted not only by what we'd seen but by what we feared was coming. The diary sat open on the table, its pages marked by trembling fingers and tear-streaked hands. It was no longer just a book, but a grim roadmap etched in ink and pain. Our conversations had grown sparse and tense, riddled with silences that spoke louder than words. Trust was frayed, every glance weighed with suspicion. The house seemed to feed on this fracture, its silence stretching to fill the spaces between us like a living thing. The sky outside was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never quite let it fall. The wind whispered faintly through the cracks in the window frames, carrying with it a cold that seemed to mock our desperation. Inside, the shadows deepened, shifting just beyond the edge of sight. I found myself drawn again to the basement door, the source of so much dread and mystery. The scratches on its surface had grown darker, almost as if bleeding into the wood. The air near it was thick and cold, heavier than any other part of the house. Standing there, I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. Despite the mounting terror, a small flicker of defiance burned inside me. Something deep in my gut refused to surrender, to give in to the darkness closing in around us. But even as I clung to that hope, I knew the house was far from done with us. That evening, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over like a sudden storm. We gathered, in the main room, the diary open on the table between us, its words both a source of desperate hope and crushing despair. The air was thick with fear and unspoken accusations, each glance sharper than the last. As the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, the lights flickered violently before plunging us into near darkness. The sudden loss of light sent a ripple of panic through the group, voices rising in confusion and fear. I fumbled for my phone, the only source of light now, its weak beam casting long, trembling shadows. Then came the noise, a low, guttural growl emanating from the basement door, followed by slow, deliberate scratching. The door, still firmly locked, rattled under the invisible force pressing against it. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before, deep, angry, and filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. Suddenly, the door slammed open with a force that sent a gust of freezing air swirling into the room. A shape emerged from the darkness below, indistinct and shifting, as if made of shadows themselves. The unblinking eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light of the phone's screen. Panic erupted. Shouts and screams filled the room as we scrambled for the exits. But the house seemed to twist and turn, the halls stretching impossibly long, doors leading nowhere. The shadows chased us, whispers growing into agonized screams that echoed through the walls. In that moment, I realized the house was not just a building, but a living entity, feeding on our fear and despair. The diary's warnings had become a trap, and we were caught in its deadly snare. The chaos after the basement door slammed open felt endless. My heart raced as I stumbled through the shifting halls, the shadows twisting around us like living things. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It was a predator, hunting every crack in our resolve. Voices rose and fell, desperate and fractured, some pleading, others accusing. I caught the terrified eyes of my friends, reflections of my own panic mirrored in their faces. Trust had crumbled long ago, replaced by suspicion sharp enough to cut. The diary lay forgotten in the turmoil, its pages fluttering like a wounded bird caught in a storm. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, we managed to barricade ourselves in a room. The cold seeped through every crack, carrying with it the weight of unseen eyes that watched without blinking. The house had shown its true face, relentless, patient, and merciless. In the quiet aftermath, a heavy silence settled. I felt numb, caught between relief and the crushing knowledge that this was far from over. The diary's words weren't just warnings. They were chains binding us tighter to the house's dark will. I thought about the friend we lost, the first to fall, and the ones who might follow. The terror wasn't just outside in the shadows, it was inside us, twisting our minds and hearts. The breaking points weren't just moments of fear, they were fractures in our very souls. As dawn's weak light crept through the windows, I realized the nightmare had become our reality. The house was alive with secrets, and we were trapped in its merciless grip, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The air felt heavier than ever as the days dragged on. We were trapped in the house, each moment thick with dread and exhaustion. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on us like a relentless storm. Every corner held shadows that whispered secrets, and Very Creek was a reminder that the house was still alive, still watching. I found myself drawn once again to the diary. It was tattered now, its pages worn thin from endless reading and trembling hands. The words seemed to shift and change, as if the book itself was alive and responding to our fear. New entries appeared, written in the same hurried, desperate script, warning of an impending end and a final chance to break free. The house outside seemed to hold its breath, the sky gray and swollen with storm clouds. The wind had died to a faint whisper, and the usual sounds of life were gone. No birds, no distant cars, only the heavy silence that wrapped around us like a shroud. We were quieter now, our conversations reduced to whispers. Hope flickered dimly in the shadows, fragile but persistent. The diary spoke of a ritual, an ancient way to fight the darkness and end the curse, but the instructions were vague, cryptic, and terrifying. The basement door remained locked, the scratches on its surface darker, almost bleeding into the wood. Every time I passed it, I felt the weight of unseen eyes following me, waiting for the moment when we might slip. Despite the fear, there was a strange clarity, a feeling that the end was near and with it a chance for salvation, but the cost would be high. The diary's final warning hung in the air like a blade. One last choice, one last fight. That night, a strange stillness settled over the house, as if it were bracing itself for something inevitable. The usual creaks and groans were replaced by a deep silence that pressed in on us, heavy and suffocating. We gathered around the fireplace, the diary resting on the cracked hearth, its pages flickering in the dim light. The ritual was complex, words in a language none of us understood, symbols drawn with trembling hands, and an offering that felt too terrible to make. But there was no other choice. We needed to try, to break the cycle before the house claimed us all. As we began, the air grew colder still. Shadows lengthened and shifted, curling around us like living things. The walls seemed to pulse, the very foundation of the house groaning under an unseen weight. A low hum filled the room, vibrating in my bones and drowning out every other sound. Suddenly, the basement door slammed open with a violent force. A chill wind roared through the house, extinguishing candles and scattering ashes. From the darkness emerged a shape, something ancient and hungry, its eyes unblinking and filled with a cold, endless hunger. Fear paralyzed us, but we continued the ritual, voices trembling yet determined. The house fought back, shaking violently, walls cracking, and shadows swirling in a chaotic dance of darkness and light. For a moment, it felt like the house would swallow us whole, but as the last words were spoken, a deafening silence fell. The shadows receded, the cold lifted, and the basement door slammed shut once more. Exhausted and shaken, we stared at the diary, unsure if we had succeeded or merely delayed the inevitable. The house was quiet for now, but the warning lingered. The fight wasn't over, and the darkness was patient. After the ritual, the house fell into a fragile silence, a quiet so deep it felt unnatural. We were exhausted, bodies trembling for fear and cold, hearts pounding in uncertain relief. I stared at the diary, its pages now stained with smudges and tears, wondering if this fragile piece was real or just the calm before the storm. The house didn't creak or groan that night. No shadows danced on the walls. Even the air felt lighter, less suffocating. For a brief moment, hope flickered, that maybe, just maybe, we had broken free from the curse that had haunted us. But the warning from the diary echoed in my mind, sharp and clear. The darkness was patient. It didn't need to strike immediately. It could wait, bide its time, and return when we least expected it. That thought gnawed at me, stealing any peace I tried to find. I looked around at the others, their faces drawn and hollow, eyes heavy with a mixture of relief and dread. We had survived, but the weight of what we'd faced clung to us like a shadow. Sleep was restless, filled with dreams of unblinking eyes and cold whispers. I realized the fight wasn't over. The house was a wound that might heal, but never fully close, and we were forever marked by the darkness that lived within its walls. The diary was no longer just a book. It was a reminder, a warning etched into our lives. We had faced the darkness and lived, but we had also become part of its story. The house was quieter than ever, but the silence was heavy, thick with unspoken fear. We moved through the rooms like ghosts, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled after the ritual. The air felt charged, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Outside, the sky was a heavy gray, the clouds low and oppressive. The wind had died to a whisper, and the usual sounds of life were gone. No birds, no distant cars, only the eerie stillness that wrapped around the house like a shroud. We gathered one last time in the living room, the diary lying open on the table before us. Its pages were worn and fragile, filled with the story of the house and the curse that had consumed so many before us. The final entries were desperate, filled with warnings and pleas for mercy that now felt like echoes from the past. The atmosphere was thick with dread and determination. We knew this night would be different, that whatever force haunted the house would make its final move. The fear was sharp and electric, but beneath it was a thread of resolve. We would face whatever came together, no matter the cost. I could feel the weight of every unseen eye watching us, waiting for the moment to strike. But I also felt something else, a stubborn spark deep inside that refused to be extinguished. The house might be ancient and cruel, but we were still here, still fighting. As the last light faded outside, shadows stretched long across the floor, swallowing the edges of the room. The final night had come, and with it, the end of the story, one way or another. As darkness fully enveloped the house, an oppressive silence settled like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick, charged with a tension that made every breath shallow and every heartbeat loud. We gathered tightly in the living room, eyes darting nervously toward the basement door, the origin of all our nightmares. Suddenly, a deep, guttural growl rolled up from the darkness below, vibrating through the floor and into our bones. The basement door rattled violently as if some unseen force was clawing to break free. Our flashlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and twisted on the walls like phantoms. The temperature plummeted. A biting cold swept through the room, wrapping around us like icy fingers. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and my skin prickled with an unexplainable dread. Then, out of the darkness, emerged a shifting mass, an amorphous figure, darker than the shadows themselves, with eyes that glowed an unnatural, malevolent red. Panic erupted. Voices rose in frantic whispers and terrified cries. We scattered, desperate to escape the encroaching darkness, but the house seemed to warp and twist, hallways stretching endlessly and doors slamming shut before we could reach them. The walls whispered cruel secrets, promises of doom whispered just beyond comprehension. In that chaos, I felt a cold presence brush past me like a breath of death. I stumbled and fell, heart pounding wildly as the shadows closed in. The house was alive, hungry and relentless. It was claiming its final victims, and we were powerless to stop it. As the night wore on, the battle between light and shadow raged on, with no clear victor. The house's hunger had reached its peak, and the final chapter of our nightmare was being written in real time. When dawn finally broke, it did so like a reluctant sigh, pale light filtering through cracked windows and weakly touching the remnants of the night's terror. The house had quieted, but the silence was brittle, as if holding its breath, waiting to pounce again. I sat on the cold floor, trembling, my body exhausted but my mind racing. The events of the night played on a loop in my head. The growls from the basement, the shape emerging from the darkness, the way the walls seemed to bend and close in around us. The house was no longer just a building. It had become a living nightmare, a predator that fed on our fear and despair. Around me, the others were silent, their faces pale and drawn. Some were crying softly, others staring blankly, lost in a fog of shock and disbelief. We had fought with everything we had, but the cost was steep. Friends were gone, and the weight of survival pressed heavy on those left behind. The diary lay closed on the table, its final pages stained and torn. It was a testament to the countless souls trapped in this cycle, a warning and a legacy of pain. The curse hadn't been broken, it had only been paused, waiting patiently for the next chapter to begin. In that moment, I understood the true horror of the house. It wasn't just the darkness lurking in the basement or the unseen eyes watching from the shadows. It was the way it burrowed into your mind, eroding hope until all that remained was fear. As the sun rose, casting weak light into the room, I realized we were marked forever. The house had claimed us in ways we couldn't see, binding us to its story, its curse, and its endless hunger. We left the house behind, stepping out into the cold morning light that felt both foreign and fragile after everything we had endured. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with the weight of the night's horrors, but the silence outside was almost a relief compared to the oppressive darkness within those walls. Yet as we drove away, a strange unease settled deep inside me. The diary was gone, left behind in the rubble, but its curse wasn't. It had slipped into us, a shadow in the corners of our minds, a whisper beneath our thoughts. The house had marked us, changed us. No matter how far we went, the memory lingered like a chill that wouldn't fade. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I swear I can still hear the scratching on that basement door. The whispers, the unblinking eyes, the cold breath on my neck, they've become a part of me, a permanent scar. The diary's final warning still haunts me. Some darkness isn't meant to be escaped. It waits, it watches, and one day it will return. Until then, all we can do is live with the echoes and hope that the next chapter doesn't begin with us.